September 12, 1944, 08:15 hours. The mechanic's name was Tanaka, and he was tightening the cowling bolts on a Mitsubishi Zero when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Not the familiar drone of Japanese engines, but something else. Something wrong. He looked up from his work, squinting against the Pacific sun already brutal at this early hour. The other ground crew members were moving between the rows of aircraft, fueling, arming, preparing for the strike mission that would launch within the hour. 40 planes, fully loaded, ready to tear apart the American invasion fleet everyone knew was coming. The sound grew louder. A single engine. American. High above them, probably another reconnaissance bird taking photographs. Nothing to worry about. They'd been flying over for days, always alone, always just looking. Tokyo Rose had been right. The Americans were predictable, cautious, dependent on their procedures and protocols. Tanaka returned to his work. He had 3 more bolts to secure before this Zero would be ready. The pilot was already in the ready room, studying maps of American ship positions. In 90 minutes, maybe less, this aircraft would be airborne, carrying death to the enemy. That's when the sound changed. The American engines pitch shifting, dropping, accelerating. Tanaka looked up again, and this time his blood went cold. The Hellcat was diving straight at them. 3 days earlier, the briefing room aboard USS Hornet had been standing room only. Charts of Peleliu covered every available surface, an ugly knuckle of coral and jungle that most of the assembled pilots had never heard of until that morning. Commander Harris, the air group leader, pointed to the northern section of the island with his wooden pointer. The Japs had 2 airfields here. Had. Past tense. Our B-24s have been pounding them for weeks. Latest reconnaissance shows minimal activity, possibly abandoned entirely. The pilots exchanged glances. They'd heard this before. Tarawa was supposed to be softened up too. That had turned into a bloodbath. The invasion kicks off September 15th, Harris continued. 15,000 Marines. High Command estimates 3, maybe 4 days of fighting before the island is secured. Your mission is routine support. Photo reconnaissance, spot any remaining defensive positions, call in naval gunfire if needed. Major Robert "Cowboy" Stout sat in the back row, studying the charts with the intensity that had kept him alive through 63 combat missions. Something about the briefing felt wrong, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. The intelligence was too neat, too confident. War didn't work that way. At 34, Stout was old by fighter pilot standards. Most of the men in this room were barely out of their teens, fresh from flight school, still believing in their own immortality. Stout knew better. He'd seen too many empty bunks, too many aircraft that simply never came back. Survival in the Pacific wasn't about courage. Courage was assumed. Standard issue, like your parachute. Survival was about judgment, about knowing when to press an attack and when to break off, about reading situations faster than the enemy could react. He'd earned his call sign Cowboy, not from any rodeo background. He'd grown up in suburban California, but from his tendency to operate independently, trusting his instincts over rigid doctrine when circumstances demanded it. Some commanders found this troubling. Others, the smart ones, recognized it as the mark of a pilot who thought 3 moves ahead. "Questions?" Harris asked. Stout raised his hand. "Sir, when was the last photo reconnaissance of those airfields?" Harris consulted his notes. 4 days ago, September 8th. High-altitude B-24 run. 4 days is a long time, sir. Japs could move aircraft in from Formosa, from the Philippines. We've seen them do it before. Hide planes in the jungle, roll them out when it's time to strike. Harris's expression tightened slightly. "Duly noted, Major. But intelligence assessment is clear. The northern airfields show no signs of recent activity. We're not expecting significant air opposition." The briefing continued, but Stout's unease remained. Intelligence had been wrong before. Catastrophically wrong. He thought of the pilots who'd died because reconnaissance photos missed something crucial. The Marines who'd walked into ambushes that satellites and aerial cameras hadn't detected. War made liars of certainty. That night he lay in his rack listening to the carrier's ambient sounds. Hull creaking, ventilation humming, distant machinery thrumming through the steel. Tomorrow's mission was supposed to be milk run simple. Fly north to Peleliu, photograph the airfields, confirm they were dead, fly back. Routine as a training flight. Except Stout had flown 63 combat missions, and exactly none of them had been routine. The Pacific sun was already brutal at 0800 hours when Stout climbed into his Hellcat's cockpit. The F-6F was democracy-made steel, rugged, powerful, forgiving of pilot mistakes in ways that Japanese fighters weren't. It lacked the Zero's elegance and maneuverability, but it could absorb punishment that would shred a Mitsubishi, and its 6.50 caliber Brownings could tear an enemy aircraft apart in seconds. Stout had named this particular Hellcat Nancy's Pride after his wife back in California. Her photograph was tucked in his flight suit pocket, creased and sweat-stained from dozens of missions. He touched it briefly. Not superstition exactly, but ritual. A reminder of what waited on the other side of this war. The deck crew chief ran through the pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision. Control surfaces checked, fuel tanks topped off, 220 gallons internal, enough for nearly 4 hours of flight time. Oil pressure nominal. All 6.50 calibers loaded, 2,400 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, each round capable of punching through aircraft aluminum like tissue paper. "She's ready for you, Major," the crew chief said, patting the Hellcat's fuselage like a favored horse. "Bring her back in one piece." "That's the plan," Stout replied, strapping himself in. The launch sequence was controlled chaos. Deck crew in colored jerseys scrambling between aircraft, hand signals directing traffic, the air thick with aviation fuel fumes and salt spray. Stout ran through his mental checklist while the engine warmed up. 18 cylinders of Pratt & Whitney radial producing 2,000 horsepower, the vibration running through the airframe like a living thing. The launch officer's flags dropped. Stout pushed the throttle to full military power, felt the Hellcat surge forward, the deck rushing past, then the sudden drop as the carrier's edge disappeared and he was airborne, climbing into the crystalline Pacific sky. The ocean stretched endlessly below, impossibly blue. Other aircraft were forming up around him, a photo reconnaissance bird, a pair of Corsairs flying top cover. The mission package looked professional, coordinated, exactly as briefed. But Stout's radio crackled with routine chatter, and beneath the professional exchanges, he heard the complacency. These pilots expected an easy mission. They were already thinking about the poker game that night, the mail call, the ice cream that the Hornets crew famously made. Nobody expected contact. Nobody expected to actually find anything worth attacking. That assumption was about to get violently corrected. Peleliu materialized through the heat shimmer at 0840 hours. A ugly sprawl of coral ridges and dense jungle that looked like something prehistoric. Stout could see the southern beaches where the Marines would land in 3 days, white sand that would turn red with blood before this campaign ended. But his target was the northern section, where intelligence insisted the airfields were abandoned. He pushed his Hellcat into a shallow dive, descending from 8,000 feet, while the camera mounted behind his cockpit automatically clicked through exposures. Standard photo reconnaissance protocol. Fly straight and level, let the equipment do its work. Don't deviate from the planned route. Except as Peleliu's details sharpened below him, Stout saw something that made his tactical mind snap to full alert. The airfield wasn't abandoned. Rows and rows of aircraft sat on the tarmac, wings almost touching. He counted quickly. The combat pilot's ability to assess enemy strength in seconds. 40 planes minimum. Zeros. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, all the aircraft types that could shred an invasion fleet. This wasn't a token defensive force. This was a strike group, positioned and ready. His thumb hovered over the radio transmit button. Protocol screamed at him to report immediately, to break off and let the fleet scramble a proper response. That was doctrine. That was the smart play. But Stout's eyes were already calculating angles and distances and opportunities. Those aircraft were parked wingtip to wingtip, closer than any sane operational doctrine allowed. Fuel drums stacked beside each plane, ground crews moving between them in the unhurried manner of men who believed they had time. They'd made a mistake, a terrible, fatal mistake. And in war, you didn't get second chances to exploit enemy mistakes. Stout made another pass, dropping to 3,000 feet. his photographer's eye cataloging every detail even as warning bells rang in his head about anti-aircraft positions. The airfield stretched along the northern coast, single runway, dispersal areas fanning out on both sides. The aircraft arrangement was almost criminally negligent. 15 feet between planes, fuel supplies right next to them. No revetments, no dispersal into the jungle, just neat rows like they were lined up for inspection. Someone down there had prioritized speed over security, probably rushing to prepare for an immediate strike against the American fleet. They'd gambled that they had time, that no single American fighter would be crazy enough to attack alone. They'd gambled wrong. Stout's tactical analysis ran at full speed. He'd been trained in ground attack at Pensacola, weeks practicing strafing runs on target sleds and painted truck hulks. The doctrine was straightforward. Come in low and fast, hit your target in a single devastating pass, get out before ground fire tracked you. But doctrine assumed you'd be attacking 1 or 2 targets, not an entire airbase. His Hellcat carried 6.50 caliber Brownings, 2,400 rounds total. At the Browning's cyclic rate of 750 rounds per minute, he could sustain about 12 seconds of continuous fire before running dry. 12 seconds to destroy 40 planes. The conventional math didn't work, but Stout realized this wasn't about conventional thinking. Those fuel drums stacked beside each aircraft. One tracer round would turn each into a bomb. One burning plane would spread fire to its neighbors. The Japanese had accidentally created a massive chain reaction waiting to happen. This wasn't about shooting down 40 planes individually. This was about lighting a fuse and letting thermodynamics do the rest. He checked his fuel gauge. Enough for the strike and the flight back with reasonable reserve. His ammunition counter showed full loads. The Hellcat felt solid, responsive, ready. But down there, hidden in the jungle, Japanese anti-aircraft positions waited. Type 96 25mm autocannons scanning the sky. Once he opened fire, every gun on that island would light him up. He'd be alone, unsupported, flying into a steel storm with no wingman and no rescue if he went down. The decision crystallized. Every second he circled was another second those aircraft sat ready to kill American sailors and Marines. He could radio back, wait for orders, watch while a proper strike package got organized. That would take 90 minutes minimum. By then, Japanese spotters would have reported the invasion fleet position. Those 40 aircraft would be airborne, scattered, hunting. The window of opportunity would slam shut forever. Stout's hand moved to the throttle, pushing it forward. The Hellcat's engine responded with a deep-throated roar. He nosed down, beginning his descent. No more reconnaissance, no more orbits. The decision was made. The Hellcat dropped like a hawk spotting prey. Stout's altimeter unwound through 2,000 feet, 1,500. He leveled off at 50 feet above the treetops, so low that palm fronds whipped in his prop wash. At this altitude, he was below most radar coverage, inside the envelope where anti-aircraft gunners struggled to track fast-moving targets. The airfield rushed toward him, 3 seconds to finalize his attack geometry. The rows of Japanese aircraft were oriented northeast to southwest, parked parallel to the runway. Stout planned his approach perpendicular to those rows, crossing multiple lines of aircraft in a single pass instead of following one row down its length. More targets in his cone of fire. More chances to trigger the chain reaction he was counting on. His airspeed indicator read 310 miles per hour as he cleared the last line of jungle. The airfield opened up before him like a shooting gallery. Suddenly he could see individual details with startling clarity. Ground crew members looking up in confusion, their faces visible for a split second before recognition turned to panic. Fuel drums stacked 3 high beside each aircraft. A Zero with its engine cowling open, maintenance still in progress. Stout's thumb found the firing button on his control stick. The 6.50 caliber Brownings were synchronized to converge at a point 300 yards ahead, creating a devastating cone of fire. He pressed the button. The Hellcat shuddered as all 6 guns opened up simultaneously. The sound was like tearing canvas amplified 1,000 times. Tracers arced out from his wings in brilliant streams, every 5th round glowing red-hot so pilots could walk their fire onto target. Stout aimed for the first row of aircraft, specifically targeting the gap between 2 Zeros where fuel drums clustered. The .50 caliber rounds walked across the coral tarmac. kicking up white dust, then stitched into the first Zero's fuselage. Metal skin peeled away like tissue paper. He held the trigger down for 2 full seconds, about 25 rounds per gun, 150 rounds total, then adjusted his aim slightly left. The fuel drums exploded. Not all at once, but in a cascading sequence that looked choreographed. The first drum erupted in an orange fireball that immediately spread to its neighbors. High-octane aviation gasoline doesn't just burn. It detonates when atomized and ignited, creating overpressure waves that propagate through vapor. The explosion caught the Zero's wing tank, which had probably been topped off for that morning's planned strike. The fighter disappeared in a secondary blast that sent burning fuel spraying across 2 adjacent aircraft. Stout was already past them, his tracers finding the next row, hammering into a Nakajima torpedo bomber's bloated fuselage. This aircraft was bigger, heavier, absolutely packed with fuel for long-range strikes against ships. When it went up, the blast was powerful enough that Stout felt the shockwave buffet his Hellcat even as he raced past at 300 miles per hour. He was 4 seconds into the run now, roughly halfway across the airfield. Behind him, fires were spreading with terrifying speed. The Japanese had parked these aircraft close enough that burning fuel from one pooled under its neighbors. Aircraft aluminum melts at 1,220 degrees Fahrenheit. Avgas burns at 2,500. Wing tanks were rupturing from heat stress even before flames touched them, dumping hundreds of gallons of fuel that flash ignited instantly. Ground crew members were running in every direction, some trying to reach fire equipment, most just fleeing for their lives. Anti-aircraft positions were starting to react, muzzle flashes winking from camouflaged positions near the runway. But they were firing blindly, tracking smoke and chaos rather than the Hellcat that had already blown past their fields of fire. Stout kept his finger on the trigger, hosing rounds across the 3rd and 4th rows of parked aircraft. A line of Aichi dive bombers absorbed his fire, their thin aluminum skins providing zero protection against .50 caliber armor-piercing rounds. One of them had ordnance still loaded. He glimpsed bombs slung under the wings in the fraction of a second before his tracers found them. The explosion was catastrophic, a massive detonation that sent a mushroom cloud of black smoke boiling upward. Shrapnel from the blast shredded 2 nearby Zeros like a giant shotgun blast, turning pristine fighters into twisted metal sculptures in an eye blink. The shockwave was strong enough that debris pattered against Stout's canopy, small fragments of aircraft pinging off the reinforced glass. The entire airfield was transforming into hell on Earth. What had started as surgical strikes on fuel drums had evolved into an uncontrolled conflagration. Fire was jumping from aircraft to aircraft, spreading through pools of burning gasoline that flowed across the tarmac following the slight grade of the runway. Secondary explosions were popping off every few seconds as ammunition cooked off inside burning aircraft. Machine gun rounds for the fighters, 20mm cannon shells, even some of the smaller bombs that hadn't been loaded yet. Each explosion fed the chaos, creating more shrapnel, more fires, more destruction. The smoke was rising in thick black columns now, the kind of smoke that would be visible from the carrier task force 50 miles away. Ground crew members who'd been performing maintenance were trapped between burning aircraft and the jungle. Stout caught glimpses of them in his peripheral vision as he roared past, men diving into drainage ditches, others beating at flames with jackets in futile attempts to save aircraft that were already doomed. A fuel truck that had been servicing the bombers took a burst of his fire and exploded with enough force to flip it onto its side, its cargo of high-octane fuel adding another 1,000 gallons to the inferno. The heat was intense enough now that Stout could feel it in his cockpit, even at 300 miles per hour. A wave of thermal energy that made the air shimmer and distorted his view of the targets ahead. His ammunition counters were winding down fast. He'd burned through about half his load in that first devastating pass, maybe 1,200 rounds across all 6 guns. But the destruction was multiplying beyond anything he could have achieved through gunfire alone. The Japanese had created a perfect storm of vulnerability, concentrated fuel supplies, tightly packed aircraft, inadequate fire suppression equipment, and probably minimal training for ground crews on how to handle this kind of disaster. Everything that could go wrong was going wrong for them, and Stout was the catalyst that had set it all in motion. Stout pulled up sharply at the end of the airfield, climbing to 500 feet to assess the damage. Anti-aircraft fire was intensifying. black puffs of 25mm shells bursting around his aircraft as gunners finally got their range. Tracers from light machine guns arced up from multiple positions, creating a web of fire he had to navigate through. The Japanese were panicking, firing at anything that moved, but their accuracy was terrible. Fear and smoke were ruining their aim. He banked hard right, using his altitude advantage to stay outside the envelope of the heaviest ground fire while he took stock of what he'd accomplished. The northern section of the airfield was completely engulfed. At least 15 aircraft were burning or already destroyed, reduced to blackened skeletons. But the southern section still had intact targets. He counted another 20 to 25 aircraft that his first pass hadn't touched. Some were already being moved by desperate ground crews trying to taxi them away from the fires. Exactly the wrong thing to do because it turned stationary targets into moving ones that were harder to hit, but still just as vulnerable. Stout grinned behind his oxygen mask. They were making his job easier. He pushed the stick forward, lining up for his second run. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by a fully alerted enemy who'd watched the first attack turn their airfield into a crematorium. Every anti-aircraft gun on Peleliu was tracking him now, crews frantically cranking elevation wheels, leading his flight path. The smoke was also a factor, thick columns of black rising thousands of feet, obscuring targets and creating turbulence that made precise flying nearly impossible. But those remaining aircraft on the southern dispersal area represented just as much threat as the ones already burning. He couldn't leave them intact. He came in from a different angle this time, approaching from the southeast instead of retracing his first run. Basic survival tactics: never repeat the same attack pattern because gunners learn to anticipate your path. His airspeed was slightly lower, around 280 miles per hour, giving him better target resolution, but also making him more vulnerable to ground fire. The trade-off was necessary. At 310 miles per hour, everything had been a blur. At 280, he could pick specific targets and make every remaining round count. His ammunition situation was getting critical. Maybe 800 rounds left across all 6 guns, which translated to about 6 seconds of firing time if he held the trigger down continuously. 6 seconds to destroy 25 planes. The anti-aircraft fire was a light show of death. Tracers crisscrossed his flight path, some passing so close he could see the glowing projectile streaking past his canopy. A 25mm shell burst 30 feet to his left, close enough that shrapnel rattled against his fuselage. Another burst dead ahead, forcing him to jink right and spoil his aim for a precious second. The Japanese gunners were getting better, adjusting to his speed and altitude, setting up kill boxes he had to fly through. Stout's training took over. Never fly straight for more than 2 seconds. Always be changing something. Altitude or heading or speed. Make yourself an impossible target to predict. He opened fire on a group of 5 Zeros that ground crews were desperately trying to taxi toward the jungle. His tracers found the lead aircraft, raking it from propeller to tail. The Zero's fuel tank erupted and suddenly the pilot was scrambling out of the burning cockpit, his flight suit already on fire. The aircraft rolled to a stop and became another torch. Stout adjusted aim, caught the second Zero as it tried to swing away, hammered rounds into its engine. Coolant sprayed in a white mist. The engine seized and the plane shuddered to a halt. 3 more bursts took out 2 more fighters in the group. The 5th Zero made it to the tree line before a lucky shot from Stout's last few rounds punctured something vital, and it nosed over into the jungle, out of commission, even if not destroyed. His guns clicked empty on the port side. The 3 left-wing Brownings had run dry. He still had his starboard guns, maybe 300 rounds remaining, but the asymmetric firepower made aiming trickier. The Hellcat wanted to pull left from the unbalanced recoil. He compensated with rudder pressure, finding more targets. A pair of dive bombers sat near a camouflaged revetment, probably being armed for a strike. He walked his remaining tracers across both aircraft, punching holes through cockpits and fuel cells. One caught fire immediately. The other just sat there leaking fuel until the spreading flames from its neighbor reached the puddle and both aircraft went up together in a satisfying double explosion. Something slammed into his Hellcat's tail section. A solid hit that made the whole aircraft shudder. Stout's eyes flashed to his instrument panel, checking for red lights or falling gauge needles. Oil pressure holding steady, hydraulics nominal, control surfaces still responding. Whatever had hit him hadn't severed anything critical. but it was a reminder that his luck couldn't hold forever. Every second he stayed over this airfield increased the probability that a Japanese gunner would get lucky and put a shell somewhere his Hellcat couldn't absorb. He squeezed off his last burst at a fuel truck near the runway, watched it explode in flames, then pulled up hard and headed for open ocean. His starboard guns were dry now, too. All 2,400 rounds expended in roughly 15 seconds of actual trigger time spread across 2 passes. Behind him, the airfield at Peleliu was dying. Stout risked one look back over his shoulder as he climbed to safer altitude, and the sight was almost unreal in its completeness. The entire northern section was an inferno. Columns of black smoke merging into a single massive pillar that rose over 10,000 feet into the tropical sky. The southern section wasn't much better. Nearly every aircraft he'd targeted on his second pass was burning or disabled, adding their smoke to the apocalyptic scene. From 5 miles away, the heat shimmer was visible, distorting the air above the runway like a mirage. Ground crews had abandoned any pretense of fighting the fires and were simply trying to survive, staying clear of the ammunition that continued to cook off in random staccato bursts. The tactical implications were staggering. 40 Japanese aircraft destroyed or rendered inoperable in approximately 8 minutes of action. That wasn't just a successful strike. It was the complete elimination of Japanese air power in the Peleliu sector. Those aircraft had represented the Japanese Navy's planned response to the American invasion. Without them, the Japanese garrison on Peleliu was blind and defenseless against air attack. The Marines landing on September 15th, just 3 days away, would have total air superiority from the moment their landing craft hit the beach. The math was brutal but simple. Each of those torpedo bombers could have sunk or crippled a transport ship. Each transport carried roughly 1,500 Marines plus their equipment. A coordinated strike by even half of those 40 aircraft could have devastated the invasion fleet, turning the shallow waters off Peleliu into a graveyard. Stout had prevented that nightmare scenario single-handedly. The Marines who would storm those beaches wouldn't know his name, wouldn't know that their unopposed landing was made possible by one pilot's decision to attack an entire airbase alone. But they'd be alive because of it. That was the calculus of war. Invisible chains of cause and effect where individual actions rippled outward to save or doom thousands. His fuel gauge was reading lower than he liked, the combat maneuvering and high-speed passes having burned through his reserves faster than planned. He pointed the Hellcat's nose toward the coordinates where USS Hornet should be and settled into a steady cruise climb. The hole in his tail section was causing some minor drag, making the aircraft slightly tail-heavy, but nothing he couldn't compensate for with trim adjustments. The radio came alive with urgent chatter. Other pilots reporting the massive smoke column rising from Peleliu. Carrier controllers demanding to know what was happening. Confusion and alarm spreading through the fleet. Stout keyed his microphone and delivered the most understated after-action report of his career. Hornet Control, this is Stout. Mission complete. Peleliu airfield neutralized, returning to base. The radio went silent for several seconds before the controller responded, his voice carefully professional, but unable to hide his disbelief. Say again your last, Stout. Did you say neutralized? Stout allowed himself a small smile. Affirmative. The airfield is no longer operational. You'll want to scramble a photo bird to get documentation. Out. Stout's Hellcat touched down on the Hornet's deck 40 minutes later, the tailhook snagging the number 3 wire with a jolt that snapped his body forward against the harness straps. Deck crews swarmed the aircraft immediately, their eyes going wide when they saw the damage. The tail section riddled with shrapnel holes. Hydraulic fluid streaking the fuselage. Scorch marks on the wings from flying through his own explosions. The plane captain who climbed up to help Stout out of the cockpit just stared at him, then at the empty ammunition counters, then back at Stout. Sir, did you hit something out there? You could say that. The whole deck seemed to pause as word spread that the pilot who'd created that massive smoke column, visible from 50 miles away, had just landed. By the time Stout's boots hit the deck, a crowd had formed. The intelligence debriefing lasted 3 hours. Stout sat in the carrier's intelligence center with maps spread across the table, walking senior officers through every detail of the attack while photo reconnaissance birds confirmed his damage assessments. The pictures told the story better than words. 40 aircraft reduced to burned-out husks. The airfield cratered and smoking. Fires still burning hours after the attack. The intelligence officers kept asking the same questions in different ways, as if they couldn't quite believe one pilot had accomplished this alone. How many passes did you make? Just 2. How much ammunition did you expend? All of it. Were you hit? Yes, but nothing critical. Did you have wingmen? No. The questions eventually stopped, replaced by a silence that felt like reverence mixed with disbelief. Commander Harris, who'd briefed the mission that morning with such confidence about minimal Japanese air presence, looked at the reconnaissance photos for a long time before speaking. Major, you understand that if those aircraft had gotten airborne during the invasion? Yes, sir, I understand. Thousands of casualties, maybe tens of thousands. That's why I couldn't wait for orders, sir. Harris nodded slowly. You violated protocol, attacked without authorization, put yourself at enormous risk. Yes, sir. And you saved the entire operation. The words hung in the air. What Stout had done was simultaneously a courts-martial offense and an act of extraordinary heroism. The kind of paradox that military regulations struggled to handle. Harris extended his hand. Well done, cowboy. Well done. September 15th, 1944. 0832 hours. The first wave of Marines hit Peleliu's beaches under a sky completely empty of enemy aircraft. They didn't know why. Intelligence briefings had warned them about possible air attacks during the landing, the most vulnerable moment of any amphibious operation, when men were packed into landing craft, unable to maneuver, perfect targets for strafing runs and bomb drops. But as Amtraks churned through the surf and Marines waded ashore, the only aircraft overhead were American, Corsairs and Hellcats circling protectively, waiting for an enemy that never appeared. Private First Class. James Mackey, 1st Marine Division, remembered thinking the landing was almost too quiet. The artillery was hammering them from the ridges inland. The Japanese were dug in deep, waiting, but the beach itself felt exposed, naked. He kept looking up, expecting to see enemy planes diving out of the sun. They never came. In the after-action reports compiled months later, analysts would note with puzzlement that Japanese air opposition during the Peleliu landings had been negligible to non-existent. This was unusual. At Tarawa, at Saipan, at nearly every major amphibious operation in the Pacific, the Japanese had thrown their air power at the invasion fleet during those critical first hours. Peleliu was different. The invasion fleet sailed unmolested. Transport ships unloaded supplies without being attacked. Medical ships moved freely without fear of airstrikes. The battle that followed was hell, worse than hell. The Japanese garrison fought from caves and fortified positions that turned every yard of coral into a killing ground. The 3-day operation that command had promised stretched into 2 months of savage fighting. Nearly 2,000 Marines were killed, another 8,000 wounded. But they weren't bombed from the air. They weren't strafed during the landing. Transport ships didn't explode in the harbor. Medical evacuation aircraft could operate freely. None of those Marines knew that their survival during those critical first days was owed to 8 minutes of violence on September 12th. To one pilot who'd looked at 40 enemy aircraft and decided that some opportunities only come once. To Major Robert Stout, who would fly dozens more missions before the war ended and never speak much about what he'd done that morning over Peleliu. The Navy awarded Stout the Navy Cross for the Peleliu mission, the service's second highest decoration for valor. The citation read in part, "For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in aerial combat against enemy Japanese forces." But the recognition came months later, long after Stout had flown dozens more missions and the war had ground forward through more islands, more invasions, more desperate fights. The ceremony was brief, the medal pinned to his dress uniform in front of assembled pilots aboard the Hornet. Handshakes and congratulations that felt hollow to Stout, who'd watched too many better pilots die in accidents or combat that didn't generate medals or citations. He never talked much about Peleliu with other pilots, deflecting questions with modest shrugs and changes of subject. In the ready-room culture of carrier aviation, where egos ran hot and pilots competed to tell the best war stories, Stout's reticence stood out. He'd done something genuinely extraordinary, but he seemed almost embarrassed by the attention it brought. "You destroyed an entire airbase alone," one young pilot pressed him over drinks one night. "How did it feel?" Stout had thought about the question for a long moment, staring into his glass. "It felt necessary," he finally said. "That's all." After the war ended in August 1945, Stout returned to civilian life with the same quiet determination that had characterized his military service. He settled in California, worked in the aerospace industry during the post-war boom, his combat experience and intimate knowledge of aircraft systems making him valuable to companies building the next generation of fighters. He raised a family, coached Little League, attended PTA meetings, mowed his lawn on Saturday mornings. His neighbors knew he was a veteran, but most had no idea about the extent of his service. His children grew up barely knowing their father had been a decorated Navy pilot who'd flown over 60 combat missions. The medal sat in a box in the attic. The flight logs and after-action reports gathered dust. The war became something that happened to someone else, in a different life. It wasn't until the 1980s, when military historians began seriously documenting the Pacific War's lesser-known actions, that Stout's Peleliu mission started receiving the attention it deserved. Dr. Robert Stout, a respected military historian specializing in Pacific naval aviation, was researching carrier operations when he stumbled across Stout's after-action report buried in National Archives files. The numbers jumped out at him immediately. 1 pilot, 40 aircraft destroyed, no support, no backup, a solo attack that by all conventional military wisdom should have been suicide. Sherrod tracked Stout down in 1987. The interview took place in Stout's modest suburban home, the old pilot clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but willing to talk about his experiences for the historical record. "Looking back," Sherrod asked, "do you think you made the right decision? Attacking alone instead of reporting back?" Stout, now 71, had looked out his window for a moment before answering. "Those Marines who landed on September 15th, they had enough to deal with without getting bombed by 40 Japanese planes. If I'd followed protocol, reported back, waited for orders, those aircraft would have been airborne before any strike package could hit them. How many men would have died? 1,000? 5,000? So you'd do it again?" "Every time. That's what the war was about, making split-second decisions that other people's lives depended on. Sometimes you get it right, sometimes you don't. That day, I got it right." Stout's Peleliu mission became a case study at military academies around the world, though most officers who studied it never learned the pilot's name. The tactical principles were what mattered to the institutions. At the Naval Academy in Annapolis, instructors used the mission to teach about exploiting enemy mistakes. The Japanese had violated basic dispersal doctrine by parking aircraft so close together. One American pilot had recognized that vulnerability and acted on it immediately. At the Air Force Academy, the mission illustrated the importance of secondary effects. Stout hadn't destroyed 40 planes through direct fire. He destroyed maybe 10 or 15 that way. The rest were consumed by fires he'd initiated, by chain reactions he'd triggered. Understanding cascading failures became crucial for both offensive and defensive planning. But perhaps the most important lesson was about initiative, about recognizing that rigid adherence to protocol can sometimes cost more lives than it saves, about training officers to think independently, to assess situations quickly, and to act decisively when circumstances demand it. The military's relationship with this kind of initiative has always been complicated. Discipline and coordination save lives. Proper planning prevents disasters. Chain of command exists for excellent reasons. But war is chaos. War presents situations that no amount of training or doctrine can fully prepare you for. Sometimes you find yourself alone over an enemy airfield, watching 40 aircraft prepare to kill thousands of your fellow servicemen, and you have maybe 30 seconds to decide whether to follow the rules or trust your instincts. Stout had trusted his instincts, violated protocol, attacked without authorization, put himself at enormous risk, and saved thousands of lives. That paradox haunted military theorists for decades. How do you train officers to be both disciplined and independent? How do you cultivate the judgment that lets someone like Stout know when to break the rules? The answer, most concluded, was that you couldn't fully train it. You could create conditions that favored good judgment, rigorous selection, extensive experience, clear understanding of strategic objectives, but ultimately warriors like Stout were rare. The kind of combat instinct he demonstrated that morning over Peleliu wasn't something you could teach in a classroom. Major Robert "Cowboy" Stout flew his last combat mission on August 10, 1945, 5 days after Hiroshima, 1 day before Japan's formal surrender offer. The mission was routine patrol. By then, Japanese air opposition had collapsed entirely. The mighty military machine that had once dominated the Pacific was reduced to scattered remnants hiding in caves and refusing to accept that the war was over. Stout brought his Hellcat back to the carrier that evening and climbed out of the cockpit for the last time as a combat pilot. His total mission count, 119. Aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 7. Aircraft destroyed on the ground, 40 in a single mission that military historians would still be analyzing decades later. But numbers only told part of the story. The complete tally of Stout's impact on the war was incalculable. How many Marines lived because Japanese planes hadn't strafed their landing craft? How many ships made it home because torpedo bombers never reached them? How many other pilots survived because Stout's actions had shifted the entire tactical balance of the Peleliu operation? The invisible math of war, the calculations that never appeared in after-action reports or medal citations. He returned to California in October 1945, still only 33 years old, with 4 years of combat behind him and an entire civilian life ahead. The aerospace industry was booming, companies desperate for engineers with real-world experience in aviation systems. Stout's intimate knowledge of fighter aircraft, what worked, what failed, what pilots actually needed versus what designers thought they needed, made him valuable. He worked on the early jet programs, consulted on aircraft carrier design, taught courses on air combat tactics to the next generation of Navy pilots. The work was interesting, meaningful, kept him connected to aviation without the constant threat of death. But there were nightmares, the ones that all combat veterans knew, dreams where he was back over Peleliu, except this time the anti-aircraft fire found him. Dreams where he watched Japanese aircraft taking off because he'd chosen to follow protocol instead of attacking. Dreams where burning aircraft exploded around him and he couldn't pull up, couldn't escape, couldn't breathe. His wife Nancy, the one whose photograph he'd carried through 64 combat missions, learned not to wake him from those nightmares. Just to be there when he surfaced, sweating and gasping, back in their suburban California bedroom instead of a burning Pacific sky. The dreams faded with time, as dreams do. Years passed, children grew up, grandchildren were born. The war became history, then ancient history, something that happened before the current generation was born. Stout rarely talked about his service. When pressed, he'd share some stories, carefully edited, stripped of their horror, turned into the kind of amusing anecdotes that people expected from war veterans. But the real memories, the weight of the decisions he'd made and the lives they'd affected, those stayed locked away. In 1985, the Smithsonian Institution began a major project to document Pacific War aviation before the last veterans passed away. Teams of historians fanned out across the country, interviewing pilots, collecting documents, preserving memories that would otherwise be lost. One of those historians, a young researcher named Jennifer Morrison, was assigned to catalog missions that had significantly impacted major operations but hadn't received substantial recognition at the time. She was looking for the hidden moments, the individual actions that had shaped battles but got buried under the larger narrative of the war. Stout's name appeared in a footnote in a book about the Peleliu invasion, just a brief mention. Major Robert Stout's solo attack on Japanese air assets, September 12, 1944. Morrison tracked down the after-action reports, read the reconnaissance photos, cross-referenced them with Japanese documents that had been captured and translated after the war. What she found astonished her. The Japanese documents told the other side of the story. Records from the 23rd Air Flotilla showed that a major strike against the American invasion fleet had been planned for September 15th. 40 aircraft were to participate,